items to put in our archive. Good evening, everyone. My name is Edward Mesa. I'm the director here at the Museums of Port Isabel. I'd like to welcome each and every one of you. Our Telling Our Stories is our oral history program for the museums. The last Thursday of each month we have this, and it's part of we welcome people from the community to come tell their stories. We've had from different families to historians giving history of the area. And tonight we record these items to put in our archives. So for the record, it is 7:06 according to my cell. And tonight's speaker is Rod Bates, and he's owner of Rio Bravo Gallery and also Antiques at Ternava. And he'll be speaking about winds that swept Point Isabel, about the storms that happened around the area. Rod?
Good evening. I just jotted down some notes here and stuff like that. The first thing I did, though, that I think is very interesting, I looked at all the historic hurricanes that I have records of. And if you go month by month, the safest months to be here are January, November, and believe it or not, May. I couldn't find a single storm for May, so we're safe.
30 days.
February, I have a couple suspect storms. In 1724, there was a severe storm that wrecked ships. And in 1789, the island was completely flooded. And that sounds like a hurricane to me. I've never seen a norther put all the dunes and everything underwater. So then in March, I have another suspect storm. That's a little early for most of our storms. There was a very strong storm that hit Port Isabel with lots of ships in the Gulf lost in 1791. And so they could be real violent late northers. They could be any kind of activity, you know, storm activity. You just can't guess what it is. But very often, historically, when a Gulf storm hit, they would call it a hurricane, just as a matter of course in the old records. April, I only have one storm noted, and that's in 1815, and it was definitely called a very violent hurricane. And then December, believe it or not, I have a hurricane for December. In 1810, there were whales washed up and many ships wrecked in the Gulf by a violent storm. Now, who knows, that could have been like our snowstorm. You know, because think about it, if the water got that cold, the whales wouldn't have survived. You know, some of them would have been stunned and would have been washed ashore. And of course, that storm could have easily wrecked any sailing vessels that were on the Gulf. So bearing in mind that those storms are more than likely winter type storms rather than tropical activity, what you've really got to watch out for is June, July, August, September, and October. And by far the worst month of the year is September. I mean, that's the one that you really got to keep your eye on the Gulf. The worst year we've ever recorded was 1933. 20 tropical storms entered the Gulf in 1933. 4 storms hit Port Isabel, 2 hurricanes, and 1 was devastating. It's among the top 3 that have ever hit Port Isabel. In June, 7 storms that I've come up with that are definite hurricanes. 1553 or 4, and there's controversy there. We call it the 1554 storm, but some authors differ. 1830, 1809, 1822, 1909, 1922, 1954, and 1958. In July, interestingly enough, I only have 4 recorded storms. And July, if you think about it, is a month where the air just gets dead quiet a lot of years on the Gulf, and there will be blue water all the way to shore. The king mackerel will be running at the jetties, and there isn't a whole lot of any kind of activity going on except the water really heating up. After a month where the water heats up like that, that's what you got to watch out for. And a friend of mine told me last year, he said, we're not going to get a storm this year. And I said, well, how are you so sure? And he said, we've got the coolest water on the entire Gulf Coast. No way. And I said, you're kidding me. And he goes, no, hottest water is where those storms will hit. They follow the heat. So that's something very interesting, isn't it? And he proved to be right, but I mean, that's kind of that's like rolling dice, I guess. July, the 4 storms that I have recorded, the 3 bad ones were 1819, 1829, and 1933. And the 33 storm was a bad storm, but it wasn't the devastating 33 hurricane. August, 7 storms. We have 1828, 1831, 1844, which was a very bad storm, 1880. I have a actual Brownsville Herald report of the 1880 storm here. 1895, 1910, and then Hurricane Ellen in 1980, which I saw and found some, I did find some nice stuff after that storm. September, I found a very interesting note among my stuff in September. In 1857, we had a tidal wave hit Port Isabel. Did you know that? And you know, there's people that say tidal waves will hit this area occasionally. Well, 1857, we had a tidal wave completely wash over the Brazos, the island, and Port Isabel. So you think about the hill the lighthouse is on, that was a heck of a tidal wave. We had 17 recorded hurricanes in September. And all I'm concentrating on is Port Isabel. Remember that. I'm not concentrating on the Gulf Coast. I'm not even trying to concentrate on all of Cameron County. All I'm concentrating on historically is from the mouth of the river to about where the 1554 shipwrecks hit. That's the little area right there. I mean, so it's a very small window that I allow to go into my notebook. And we've had 17 definite storms, the worst of which is probably the worst storm that's ever hit Port Isabel, and that was 1867. I was telling some folks earlier, that storm that hit Florida, Andrew, that's like Andrew times 5, that storm. It was, it devastated Brownsville, it devastated Matamoros, it wiped out every coastal city in the area. It was a terrible, terrible storm. October, 6 storms. They're less frequent in October, but when they hit, they're very, very violent. They're devastating storms. 1837, 38, 48. I have the 1884 here, I believe. 1912 and 1950 are our October storms. November, 0, and then the one that I mentioned in December. Probably the most famous hurricane from our area here is the reason this building is dedicated to the Spanish, and that's the 1554. And it literally drove the Spanish Flota de Plata across the entire Gulf of Mexico and wrecked them here. And among the famous people aboard that Flota de Plata was Ponce de Leon's daughter. He actually landed on Padre Island with the survivors, but did not make it back to Mexico. Only 2 people survived the shipwreck here on Padre Island. One was a man that stayed with the boats and hid in the boats from the Indians, and the other was a priest. And I think his name was Friar Marcos de Mina. And he survived. He made it all the way down. He took an arrow in the eye, other arrow hits. He was buried by his friends who thought he was going to die. Interestingly enough, if you piece together the story of the Spaniards going down Padre Island and what have you, there's a very interesting little tidbit I've never heard anybody else mention. There was 4 priests that all got together, and what they did, right where I believe the Brazos Santiago cut is, they came to the mainland because they found a canoe. One of their number died as soon as they reached the mainland, and so probably the first religious service held by a Western European was held at Port Isabel, Texas in 1554 in September, because they buried him with Catholic rites on a tall hill. They said, well, this is the only area around here that has tall hills. So that's a very interesting little notation, isn't it? The Flota lost tremendous treasure for the Crown of Spain. And until Mel Fisher discovered the Atocha, that was the richest treasure salvage operation that happened in 1555. They went back and Friar Marcos got a piece of it. And also the man that, I think his name was Vasquez, that stayed with the boats, he got a piece of it. And at any rate, they helped find the treasure for the crown. And the treasure salvage operation they did in the summer of 1555 was the most profitable treasure salvage operation until Mel Fisher salvaged the Atocha. So that was quite a fleet that was wrecked there. And then of course, we still have some stuff they missed. So it's an incredible deal. The next real famous storm that hit Point Isabel was what's called the Racer Storm in history. And the Racer Storm in the 1800s was a very famous storm, but almost everybody's forgotten about it in the 20th century. And what happened was there was a merchant fleet sailing from Veracruz to New York. They got about halfway across the Gulf, and this violent hurricane hit them. And the captain made a fateful decision. He said, let's turn with the wind and let's try to sail, beyond this thing. It'll turn away from us. And so they literally raced the hurricane all the way to the Texas coast. And several boats were dashed and what have you, but the Racer Storm's a very famous one. That happened in October. That's one of our October storms, 1837. The next storm of historical significance is the 1844 hurricane. And that hurricane is really important to the development of South Texas. And people don't think about it like that, but it really is. It was a tremendously violent storm. In 1829, the Mexicans built a fort and a customs house on Brazos, Santiago. And the fort literally had cannons pointing out into the Brazos Santiago Pass to guard the entry into the port. When William Neal first came to South Texas, he was an English immigrant, and he came to Mexico, to Veracruz. He joined the Mexican Navy, and he served in the war with Texas, and he served, I think, 10 years in the Mexican Navy. And he got out and he wanted to see this Brazos Santiago and the port at the pass there and everything like that. So in 1836, he sails into the port of Brazos Santiago. He comes through the pass and he sails in, and he made a notation in his diary that's incredible if you think about it. He said the port is a fine port, the pass is easily made, and he said 20 tall-masted ships could anchor and swing in the tide without affecting each other in the bay. So that's incredible, all right? 1844 cleared the pass even more. That's why during the Mexican War, they had sandbars to deal with and stuff like that. But if you study, they had center wheel steamers and other boats coming right to Point Isabel to the docks to load cargoes, all right? Now that's something with those boats, without that channel that's cut in there today, you couldn't do that. Especially where the old bridge is. When I was young, that was very deep water. Today, bigger boats will draw a mud trail through there off the end of that old fishing pier where the old bridge was. So when I was young, any boat that wanted to could go right through there. And now, you draw a mud trail if you draw maybe 3 feet of water. So the bay is definitely silting in certain areas, and other areas are getting deeper. It's just the way nature is. But that 1844 storm, what it did is it just cleaned that harbor right on out, man. So in 1846, it hadn't silted in enough that the American vessels couldn't get into the harbor. And that's why the commerce boomed. So that 44 storm, even though it devastated the area, it wiped out the Mexican fort on Brazos, Santiago. It wiped out the customs house. They moved the operation to Port Isabel. Only one house stood after the storm in Port Isabel, and that was on top of the hill where the lighthouse now stands, and it became the customs operation. That's where they put it. That's why General Taylor chose that site as his headquarters when the American Army came in March of 46. So that hurricane, it literally wiped out all life in Baghdad. It wiped out all life in Burita. It devastated Matamoros. Brownsville didn't exist yet. Only one building survived in El Fronton, Port Isabel. And so that was a terrible storm, but the reason there wasn't more loss of life is because this area was just so sparsely populated. And lessons learned from that storm were used by the Mexicans who were in control here. It was the Mexican Customs House and the Mexican Army. The Mexican Army even made Port Isabel their base of operation then, El Fronton at the time. and there was 250 infantry, 40 artillery, and a regular patrol of cavalry that worked out of El Frontón. And our local land boss, Don Garcia, was the general of Port Isabel and the general of the local troops. And if you read in Taylor's account in 1846, it was General Garcia who took his troops by land to try to hook up with Arista. And that's why Port Isabel was evacuated, because he didn't have enough troops to stop the American army, but if he figured if he got to Matamoros and joined up with the rest of the army, they could retake it. So that's why Port Isabel was abandoned. Because if it was for abandoned for fear, he would have given up his whole ranch, because he owned the place, you know. So the reason he did it was to get more troops, reinforce the regular army, and come in and retake the town. The next devastating storm is the most violent one. I call it in my notes here the big one. The 1867 hurricane is by far the most violent hurricane that's ever hit the Port Isabel area, South Texas. And the eye passed right over the mouth of the river, right across to what would be today the extreme north side of Brownsville. The eye hit right across there. And even though Brownsville was ever so slightly on the south side of the storm, they still, 3/4 of the buildings in Brownsville were leveled. Matamoros suffered the same fate. 3/4 of the buildings in Matamoros were leveled. Port Isabel was demolished. Clarksville and Baghdad were never rebuilt. They were lost forever. Residents who were in Matamoros and Brownsville that went after the storm back to Baghdad couldn't even recognize where their houses used to be. Everything was gone, swept clean. And of course, Father Parasat, who was the missionary to Baghdad, said that it was because of their wretched sins, the way they lived. But he did. He called them the Sodom and Gomorrah of the New World, Clarksville and Baghdad. And he said it was a terrible place. And his book, if you ever get a chance to read his book, it's called Reminiscence of a South Texas Missionary. And it is awesome. It's really a neat little window into 1850s and 60s South Texas. That storm, by the way, changed the bay. It changed the way the bay flows. And South Bay had several channels formed that are still open today, but the main inlet to South Bay was slightly closed by the 1867 storm. And it stayed just slightly open, slightly closed, if you will, for years after that, and then the Corps of Engineers came in the early 1900s and plugged it, and that's why there is no Boca Chica, even though there's a place called Boca Chica, because the Corps of Engineers sealed what would be the smallmouth or the southern outlet for South Bay. They sealed it. And by the way, where the boats used to anchor at Brazos, Santiago, that Mr. Neal talked about in the 1830s and 40s, is now the highest piece of land on Brazos Island. That's right where all the spoils were dumped. And so right where the boat harbor used to be is now the tallest hill on Brazos Island. And you can see it, if you go to the jetties, you can look across and see this hill over there. It's got what looks like a platform on top of it and stuff, and that is the spoil hill. And it connected Clark Island to to Brazos Island at that time. Yep. The next violent storm, and by the way, in 1867, September 3rd is when that storm hit. September 29th, another storm we would normally talk about hit. So they got whacked twice in 1 month in 1867. And other notes I had here, the Brazos and White Ranch Railroad was completely abandoned after that. They just gave up on it. Let's see here. The next one is the one most residents will tell you is the most violent hurricane that's ever hit here, and that's because it's in our memories, and that's the 1933. And I'm just going to briefly touch on the 33 because we have an eyewitness account next month. So I'm going to just leave her alone. But 33, September the 5th, we had a devastating hurricane at Port Isabel. And a lot of the newspaper accounts at the time talk about it setting Port Isabel back 5 years, which would be right back to when Point Isabel Land Company started developing Port Isabel and everything like that. And it really did devastate the area. I have old photographs of Port Isabel pre-storm and post-storm in 33. And the difference with population and everything is just, it's amazing. I talked to an old man, I was buying a coin collection one time, and he had a Port Isabel token that I bought. And we started talking about the 33 storm, and he said, oh yeah, I went through it. And I went, you're kidding me. And he goes, no, no, I went through it. He lived in San Benito. And he said, it's the worst storm ever in San Benito. And so we got to talking and everything like that, and he said, you know, there were boats that wound up on the outskirts of San Benito from Port Isabel. And then later on, I talked to Captain Vic, Captain Victor Delgado. He told me the same thing. He said, the roads were impassable, but we had many boats that disappeared. And he said it was 2 weeks before we could drive down the muddy roads to get, you know, out of Port Isabel and go get help and supplies and stuff. He said we found our boats near San Benito. So it's collaborated by two different sources, you know, that actually witnessed the storm. And Captain Vic's account is very interesting because he wrote it out on the Coast Guard cutter. So, yeah, that was pretty bad. 1967 is the next one that's a historic storm, and that is Beulah. And I'll never forget, because that was the year we came here. It was after the storm. And as a kid, I remember driving through like Los Fresnos and all over, and you'd see tape on the windows, and I'd just, why would they put that ugly tape on those windows? Of course, we all know now that's to keep glass from flying around, but Hurricane Beulah happened September 20th. So notice our September pattern here. It's very, very real. If anybody would like to look at them, don't you get terribly bored when somebody reads something in front of a group? If you would like to look at it, I have here, this one is a very interesting account of the 1909 hurricane that hit Port Isabel. There were 2 lives lost. That was a very mild hurricane. But back then there were no warning systems, so guys out on the bay and stuff like that, those are usually the lives lost. And then I have an interesting account of the 1880 storm. And this one, Judge Pierce was actually here fishing from Brownsville. And he talks about, they even get into the 1867 storm, and he talks about how the 1880 storm, until that point, was the most violent since 67. And these are people that went through 67 and were here in 1880. And he related that the 80 storm was nasty. And he talks about the guys that rode it out at the life-saving station on Brazos Island. They were around the end of Padre. And it says here, it hit August 11th in the afternoon. And the water went completely over the island. The water went over Brazos Island. Miracle anybody lived. But there were survivors that got to talk about it to the newspaper. And the thing that I always am stunned about when these violent storms hit and all this kind of stuff, life goes on. These people just picked up, they went out and gathered lumber and built another shack, and life went on. And so people that really fear hurricanes hitting this place, there's a good reason, because property values and stuff like that, but life will go on. And we'll have a beautiful place when we're done. I kind of like it here right now, and there's been a lot of violent hurricanes. And even after a storm, this is still a great place to live. And eventually, a real nasty one's going to hit. We're going to get another one, like 67. It's going to happen. So you just got to prepare yourself here first, and then the rest of it will kind of fall into place, hopefully. Huh? Is there any questions?
I have one. When Brazo Island was down there, and you had the Fort of Matamoros, or the Mexican soldiers over there, how far did that go? Did that go from there all the way to Clarksville?
No, because Brazos Island wasn't even part of the mainland back then. Brazos Island was a 6-mile island with a waist-to-chest deep pass between it and the mainland. So you know where Highway 4 goes right down to Boca Chica and dumps right there on the beach? You'll notice that the bay kind of tapers and kind of dies right there at the pavement. That used to be a pass. So if you look at where the grass is on the Texas side, and then across that salt flat, the grass starts on the island side, that used to be all water right there. And it would flow through, and that was the Boca Chica. That was the small pass. The big pass was the Paso de Brazos de Santiago, the big pass between Padre Island and Brazos. And then from there, it was Texas mainland, but it was beach all the way to the Boca del Rio, which was Clarksville at the north side of the Boca del Rio. So there was another 6 miles there or so, or 4, of Texas mainland. So there was a little foot of Texas mainland, Brazos Island, and Padre Island. And so the Mexican fort was on Brazos. The soldiers would routinely wade across that small pass, and usually on high tide it was about chest deep. You can imagine for the mestizos from down south with their tall gear on, they were probably walking about here, because I mean the Mexican soldiers were notoriously small.
Okay, then when the French was here and they were all fighting, you know, in the Civil War,
Mhm.
and with the French and the Mexican, well, they're always fighting there. Where was that at, Rod?
Well, it was still the same,
It was all
but the
there?
French were on the south side of the river.
Okay.
They controlled Baghdad. And when the Imperial Army fell, a lot of those troops came across the river and surrendered to the Union Army in Clarksville and Brazos Santiago, rather than fall into the hands of the Republicans and probably be put to death. So a lot of them jumped the river and came over here.
All right, now, let's go up the river. Let's go all the way up to Matamoros there. At that time, that was called Santa Cruz. And where was the custom house there?
Right where the bridge lands.
The International Gateway?
Where the old International Bridge where it lands, that was
Okay.
where the customs house was. And that's where the landing was too.
Because
There's
they-
a reason for that. It was on a point. And if you think of rivers, the worst place to put anything is in the bend of a river, because it's constantly eaten. The best place to land is on the point. And so right there on the point is where they have the customs.
All right, okay, where Casamata is there, you know, where the river
Mhm.
comes around this way, is that the point that you're talking about?
Yeah,
right
but
there?
it's a great
That's-
big point.
Yeah, on,
It's just like Point
Curves.
Isabel goes from the other side of South Bay all the way up to basically, you know, Derry. I mean, that's all the point. It's a
All right.
giant point of land, but if you look at it on a map, it's rather small and a very large point.
okay.
Yes, ma'am.
Well, I was wondering, if you said one of the last big storms we had was in the 80s, right?
Yes.
We didn't have as many hotels and all that stuff on the island at the time. Now, there have been some people, older people who live here that kind of know quite a bit of the history, and they're saying they don't think that Port Isabel will be hit as strongly as it could have been because of all the buildings that are there. That they would be kind of like a break. I mean, it's going to get hit and be
Mhm.
bad, but it would probably be saved somewhat because of the structures that are there. What do
The
you
problem would be the rising water.
think?
Water will,
Yeah, surge.
yeah, and the whole deal is you'll have wind between, I don't think that'll save them as much. It'll keep shipwrecks from coming across probably and stuff like that, but I mean, and you know, even though it's brilliant engineers building a lot of those, there's no guarantees they're gonna sit either.
We
You know,
had,
those hotels are,
we had 12 feet of water that came across.
yeah.
And those sand dunes at that time were high sand dunes.
A lot better than they are.
And it just pushed those all back into the houses that are about full of rock.
You know, the 33 storm, you gotta remember, the only thing above the water line was the lighthouse and up by the Yacht Club Hotel. That was the only thing above the water line in the 33 storm. So, yes.
I'd like to have you talk a little bit about what did go on at Clarksville, and because I read quite a bit about that too, and the activities,
Oh,
and
it
why
was-
they said it was wiped out, and then the time you saw that guy said he saw the ruts from the wagon train
Oh,
down
we saw
after the
those.
hurricane.
Yeah, and that was at Brazos
And he
Santiago.
saw some remnants of old things that were from the hurricanes way back in the dunes.
Definitely. It'll happen the next hurricane.
And the
It's
things
interesting.
you found down there too, some of the things you've uncovered.
Well, they're in the museum, so
But
they're,
I mean, some of the things you've uncovered after hurricanes.
oh, we found everything. I mean,
What did you find? Tell us.
I have found everything from coins to bottles to bones, buckles, guns, you name it. We have found it after hurricanes there. And, it'll never happen again either, by the way, because all those sites now are under wildlife management, and they will not allow anybody back there, period. You cannot walk back there. So,
Of course, if you get a hurricane and the wildlife guys aren't around, people are going out back there.
pretty healthy find, I'll tell you what.
But you found the
Yeah.
wagon ruts
Oh,
from
yeah.
from the army?
Yep, after Hurricane Allen, we went up the beach and we actually found the wagon ruts, and we followed the wagon ruts right to the foundation of the Singer Ranch. I mean, I just followed wagons right to the ranch
And then you
because the
dug,
clay
right?
was exposed.
Oh, wow.
Yeah,
Did you
found
find
the coin?
anything up there?
yeah. Oh, yeah, yeah. I found coins up there, I found big old brass spikes, bottles, you name it, we found a lot of stuff up there.
Any guns?
I have found pistols before, but most of those I found on Brazos. And here in Point Isabel, I found some pistols before, but I've never found a musket or a rifle. But there was a really neat one pulled up by a fisherman, I think, what, a year ago? Something like that? Ed would know. It's about a year ago, and the museum has it. It's in the archives back here, and they're soaking it until it can be preserved. But
Now, who owns most of that land, say from
the state does now,
the state?
or the
does now?
federal government. Federal government. They bought it for a federal wildlife management area.
From, say, how far up to the cut?
Well, actually, you
From the
go
cut
north.
down.
Here's something that's rather interesting. Right now, as we speak, there are